I didn't wake up one day and decide to disappear. It happened slowly, like a quiet crack spreading through glass. At first, it was just exhaustion, the kind that sleep couldn't fix. Every morning felt heavier than the last, like I was dragging someone else's life behind me. Meetings, deadlines, traffic, noise, it all blurred together until I couldn't tell if I was working to live or just living to keep working. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. Nothing dramatic. No shouting, no disaster. Just an email, another urgent request stacked on top of 10 others. I stared at the screen for a long time, then closed my laptop. Not for a break. Not for the day. For good. That night, I started searching. At first, it was just curiosity. Cheap land for sale. Off-grid living. How to live without utilities. But the deeper I went, the more something inside me clicked into place. There were people out there, real people, living without the constant noise. No power bills. No neighbors 10 feet away. No one telling them what color to paint their door or where they could park their car. Freedom. It took me 6 months to find the land. Most of the listings were garbage, tiny lots, overpriced parcels, or places buried under restrictions. But then I found it. 50 acres, miles away from the nearest paved road. No utilities. No structures. Just trees, open sky, and silence. The price was low enough that I thought it was a mistake. It wasn't. When I called the agent, she sounded almost surprised anyone was interested. "It's pretty remote," she warned. "No infrastructure at all." "That's the point," I said. I visited the property a week later. The drive alone told me everything I needed to know. The road turned from asphalt to gravel, then from gravel to dirt, then nothing. Just a narrow path cutting through trees. When I finally stepped out of the truck, the silence hit me first. Not quiet. Silence. No traffic. No distant hum of electricity. Just wind moving through leaves. I stood there for a long time, letting it sink in. This wasn't an escape. This was a reset. I bought the land 2 weeks later. The paperwork was straightforward. I remember asking the agent one specific question. "There's no HOA, right?" She shook her head immediately. "No, nothing like that out here." I made sure of it myself, too. I checked county records, zoning laws, restrictions, everything I could think of. There were no associations, no shared developments, no hidden clauses tying the land to anything else. It was mine, completely mine. Or at least, that's what I believed. The first year was the hardest. There was no cabin waiting for me. No well, no power, no safety net. Just land. I started with a tent, then a small shed, then slowly built a cabin piece by piece. Every nail, every board, every mistake, it was all mine. I learned things the hard way. How to store water. How to keep food from spoiling. How to fix things when they broke, because out there was no one else to call. When I installed my first solar panel system and saw the lights turn on for the first time, it felt like a bigger victory than anything I'd ever done in the city. By year 2, I had a routine. Wake up with the sun, work on the land, maintain what I'd built, improve it where I could. Evenings were quiet, just me, the fire, and the kind of peace I didn't know existed before. There were challenges, of course. Storms that pushed the cabin to its limits. Winters that tested every system I had. Moments where I questioned if I'd gone too far. But I never regretted it. Not once. Years passed. The cabin became a home. The land became something more than just property. It became part of me. I knew every tree line, every rise in the ground, every shift in the seasons. I wasn't surviving anymore. I was living. Occasionally, I'd drive into town for supplies. It was a small place, the kind where everyone notices someone new. At first, people asked questions. "You're living out there? By yourself? No utilities?" Eventually, they got used to me. Sometimes I'd hear things, small bits of conversation that didn't seem important at the time. Talk about new developments, land being cleared somewhere beyond the hills, investors coming in. I never paid much attention. It had nothing to do with me. Or so I thought. Around year 6, I noticed the first change. It was subtle, easy to ignore if you weren't paying attention. A faint sound in the distance, machinery, maybe. It didn't last long, and it didn't seem close enough to matter. By year 7, it happened again. Louder this time. I remember standing outside the cabin, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It was still far away, but it was there. A reminder that the world I'd left behind wasn't as far away as I wanted to believe. Still, my land was mine. I had the paperwork, the boundaries, the proof. No one had any claim to it. 8 years. 8 years of building something from nothing. 8 years without interference, without rules, without anyone telling me how to live on my own land. That's why, on the morning I found the notice nailed to my door, my first reaction wasn't fear. It was confusion. I stared at the paper for a long time before pulling it off the wood. It looked official, too official. Bold lettering, legal language, a number printed so clearly it almost didn't feel real. $47,000. I actually laughed, out loud, because it didn't make any sense. There was no HOA, no community, no shared anything. Just me, my cabin, and 50 acres of land that I had owned alone for nearly a decade. But as I kept reading, that feeling started to change. The words were precise, calculated, confident, outstanding dues, community obligations, failure to comply. And then one line that made my grip tighten on the paper. Your property is within the jurisdiction of the association. I read that line again and again because I knew something wasn't right. I had checked everything, every document, every record, every detail before I bought the land. Everything except one thing. By the time I hit my second year on the land, survival wasn't the goal anymore. Stability was. The difference sounds small, but out there it meant everything. In the beginning, every day had been about getting through it. Finding water, keeping warm, making sure nothing I built collapsed overnight. But now, things had settled into something that almost felt normal. I had systems. Not perfect ones, but systems that worked. Water came from a collection setup I'd built myself. Rain first, then a backup storage tank I refilled whenever I made supply runs into town. It wasn't convenient, but it was reliable. Power came from the solar panels I'd mounted just beyond the cabin. On clear days, they gave me more than enough. On bad days, well, I learned to plan ahead. Food was a mix of effort and strategy. I grew what I could, simple crops at first, then more as I figured out the soil. The rest I stored carefully. Out there, waste wasn't just a mistake. It was a problem you'd feel later. Every part of my day had purpose. Morning started early. Not because I had to, but because the land pulled me out of sleep before the sun fully broke the horizon. I'd step outside, feel the air, listen. It sounds strange, but after a while, you start to notice things. Changes, patterns, warnings, wind shifting, birds going quiet. The kind of silence that means something's coming. By midday, I was working, fixing, building, improving. There was always something that needed attention. A loose board, a weak joint, a better way to do something I'd already done once. Out there, comfort didn't come from buying things. It came from making them better. Evenings were the opposite. Quiet, still, controlled. I'd sit outside the cabin most nights, watching the light fade across the trees. No noise, no distractions. Just time, real time, to think. That was something I hadn't expected. In the city, thinking felt rushed, distracted, like your brain never fully caught up with itself. But out there, with nothing pulling at you, your thoughts stretch out. They settle. Sometimes that's peaceful. Sometimes it's not. There were nights when the silence felt too big, when the distance between me and everything else in the world felt real. Not romantic, not freeing, just real. But those moments passed, and every time they did, I felt stronger for it. By year 3, the cabin wasn't just functional, it was solid. Reinforced, expanded. I'd added storage, improved insulation, even built a small workspace just off to the side. It wasn't fancy, but it didn't need to be. It was mine. That mattered more than anything. Trips to town became less frequent over time. At first, I went every week, then every 2 weeks. Eventually, once a month was enough. I had learned how to stretch resources, how to prepare, how to avoid needing anything I couldn't provide myself. Still, those trips were important, not just for supplies, but for connection. The town was small, but not unfriendly. People talked, asked questions, some out of curiosity, others because they genuinely couldn't understand why anyone would choose to live the way I did. You don't get lonely out there? One guy asked me once, leaning against the counter of the local store. Sometimes I admitted. He nodded like he expected that answer. And that's worth it. I didn't answer right away, because it wasn't a simple question. But after a moment, I said, "It is." And I meant it. Around that time, I started hearing things. Not directly, not clearly, just conversations. Bits and pieces while standing in line. Mentions of land being bought up outside town. Developers coming in. Plans for expansion. New roads, new housing, maybe even something bigger. I never paid much attention. That world wasn't mine anymore. Or at least, I thought it wasn't. The first time I saw something different on my way back to the cabin, I almost missed it. It was subtle. A patch of land that had been cleared near the edge of a distant ridge. Not close enough to matter. Not even close enough to hear anything from. Just different. I slowed the truck for a second, looked, then kept going. Land changes. Trees fall. It happens. But then it happened again. A few months later, another section, larger this time. Cleaner. More deliberate. Not random clearing. Planned. That's when I started paying attention. By year 4, there were signs of something bigger. Not near my land, but not as far as it used to be either. Once on my way back from town, I saw a truck parked off the side of the dirt path. Not broken down. Not lost. Just there. 2 men were standing nearby, looking out over the land like they were measuring it without tools. I slowed down as I passed. One of them glanced at me, but didn't wave. Didn't speak. Just watched. It wasn't threatening, but it wasn't nothing either. After that, I started noticing small things. Markers. At first, I thought they were just random stakes. The kind surveyors leave behind when they're mapping land. Bright, unnatural colors against the earth. Hard to miss once you know what to look for. The first one I saw was near what I thought was the outer edge of my property. I remember walking up to it, crouching down, checking for any markings or labels. There weren't any. Just a stake driven into the ground like it belonged there. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Surveyors worked all over the place. It didn't automatically mean my land was involved. Still, I pulled out my phone that night and went back through my documents. Date, boundaries, coordinates. Everything matched. Everything was exactly where it should be. So I let it go. Or at least I tried to. But over the next year, those markers didn't disappear. They multiplied. Not on my land, not clearly, not directly, but close enough that I couldn't ignore them anymore. It was like something was slowly moving closer. Quietly. Deliberately. And the worst part was, no one had said a word to me. No letters. No notices. No official contact. Nothing. 8 years of living out there, and suddenly there were signs, small, controlled, intentional signs, that something was changing around me. I should have pushed harder then. Asked questions. Gone deeper into the records. Talked to someone who knew what was happening. But I didn't, because I still believed the same thing I had believed from the start. That my land was separate, untouched, mine. And for a while longer, it still felt that way. Until the day I found something that didn't feel like a coincidence anymore. It was early morning. Quiet. Still. I was walking the edge of my property, something I did every now and then just to stay familiar with the boundaries. That's when I saw it. A marker. Not near the edge. Not close. But inside. Not far, but far enough that it shouldn't have been there at all. I stopped walking. Just stood there, staring at it. Because this one was different. It wasn't random. It wasn't faded or worn. It was new, placed with purpose. And for the first time in 8 years, something about my land didn't feel entirely under my control anymore. I didn't touch the marker right away. I just stood there, staring at it like it might explain itself if I gave it enough time. It was a simple thing, wooden stake, bright paint at the top, but it didn't belong. Not there. Not inside my land. I knew my boundaries too well for this to be a mistake. I had walked them, measured them, lived them for years. Slowly, I stepped closer. The ground around it had been disturbed recently. Not by animals, not by weather, by someone. The soil was still loose, slightly darker than the rest. Fresh. That meant one thing. Someone had been on my land. And not long ago. I crouched down, running my fingers lightly over the wood. No label, no tag, nothing identifying who put it there. Just a mark, like a silent claim. For a second, I considered pulling it out, just removing it like it had never been there. But something stopped me. Maybe instinct. Maybe the feeling that this wasn't random, and that removing it wouldn't solve anything. It would just hide the problem. So I left it, but I didn't forget it. That entire day felt different. Every sound carried more weight. Every movement caught my attention. I found myself pausing more, listening longer, scanning the tree line like I was expecting to see someone watching. No one was. At least no one I could see. That night, I pulled out all my documents again. Date, survey maps, coordinates. I went through everything slowly, carefully, line by line. If there was a mistake, if I had missed something, it had to be in there. But there wasn't. The boundaries were clear, defined, filed properly with the county. No shared access points, no easements that cut through the center of the property, nothing that would justify someone placing markers inside my land. On paper, everything was solid, which made the reality in front of me harder to ignore. The next morning, I went back out. The marker was still there. Of course it was. But now that I was looking for them, I started seeing more. Not inside, not yet, but closer than before. Along the outer edges, near the tree lines. Subtle, spaced out, but connected in a way that didn't feel accidental. It looked like someone was mapping something. And whatever it was, it included my land. A few days later, I decided to drive further out than usual. Past the usual supply route. Past the point where I normally turn back. I wanted to see how far this went. How much had changed while I wasn't paying attention. It didn't take long to find the answer. About 15 minutes out, the land opened up. Where there had once been dense trees, there was now a wide stretch of cleared ground. Not rough clearing, clean, deliberate work. The kind that comes with planning, funding, and purpose. There were machines too. Idle at the moment, but clearly active. Tracks in the dirt. Piles of material stacked neatly off to the side. This wasn't a one-time job. This was a project. I parked the truck and stepped out slowly, taking it all in. The silence was different here. Not natural. Interrupted. Like the land itself had been forced into something it didn't choose. You lost. The voice caught me off guard. I turned to see a man walking toward me from one of the machines. Mid-40s maybe, wearing a worn cap and work boots covered in dust. He didn't look surprised to see me, but he didn't look welcoming either. No, I said, just looking around. He nodded once, like he didn't entirely believe me. Private development, he said, gesturing loosely around him. You shouldn't be out here. I frowned slightly. This used to be open land. Not anymore. His answer was quick. Practiced. I glanced past him, trying to get a better sense of how far this stretched. What kind of development? He hesitated for just a second. Residential, he said. Community build. That word stuck. Community. I looked back at him. How far out does it go? He shrugged. Far enough. That wasn't an answer. Does it reach past the ridge? I asked, pointing in the general direction of my land. He followed my gesture, then looked back at me. This time, his expression shifted slightly. Not hostile, just careful. Plans change, he said. Lines move. Something about the way he said it didn't sit right. Lines move. I didn't respond. Just nodded once, got back in the truck and drove off. But his words stayed with me the entire way back. Lines move. That wasn't how land worked. Not legally. Not without process, paperwork, notice. You couldn't just move boundaries because it was convenient. At least, you weren't supposed to. When I got back to the cabin, the place felt different. The same trees. The same structure. The same silence. But something underneath it had shifted. Like I was seeing it through a different lens now. I grabbed my maps again, this time comparing them to satellite images I'd downloaded months ago. At first glance, nothing seemed off. But the more I looked, the more I started noticing small inconsistencies. Cleared sections that weren't there before. Faint lines cutting through areas that used to be untouched. It was subtle, but it was real. And then I saw something that made my stomach tighten. A thin, almost invisible line, running closer to my land than it should have been. It wasn't labeled. It wasn't official, but looked like a boundary. A new one. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the screen. Because if that line meant what I thought it did, then the marker I found wasn't random. It was part of something bigger, something planned, and something that, somehow, had already started moving toward me without a single word. That evening, I walked the edge of my land again. Slower this time, more deliberate. And that's when I saw it. Not a marker, not a stake. A sign. Small, clean, recently placed. It stood just beyond what I knew was my boundary, but close enough that there was no mistaking its intent. White background. Bold, dark letters. I stepped closer, my eyes narrowing as I read it. A name. An official one. The name of an HOA. I didn't recognize it. Had never heard it before. But it was there, planted like it belonged. Like it had always been part of this land. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense at all. Because HOAs didn't just appear. They didn't just claim land that wasn't part of them. And they definitely didn't show up 8 years after someone had already been living there. Unless I looked back toward my cabin, barely visible through the trees. Then back at the sign. And for the first time, a thought crossed my mind that I couldn't shake. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't random. This was deliberate. And whatever was happening, it wasn't going to stop at a sign. The paper felt heavier than it should have. That was the first thing I noticed after pulling it off the door. Not physically heavy, but deliberate. Like it had been placed there with intention, knowing I would find it, knowing I wouldn't be able to ignore it. The edges were still crisp. No moisture damage, no fading. It hadn't been there long, which meant someone had come all the way out here just to leave it. I turned it over once, then back again, like maybe I'd misunderstood something the first time. I hadn't. The number was still there. $47,000. Not estimated. Not suggested. Exact. I walked inside the cabin slowly, closing the door behind me without taking my eyes off the page. The quiet that used to feel peaceful now felt tight, pressed in, like the walls were listening. I set the paper down on the table, then immediately picked it back up again. There had to be a mistake. Something this absurd didn't just happen without a reason. I started reading properly this time. Not scanning, reading. Line by line. Notice of outstanding dues. Failure to comply with community obligations. Accumulated fees over a period of 8 years. 8 years. I stopped there, because that part didn't just sound wrong. It sounded impossible. I hadn't even known this community existed 8 years ago. I kept going. The language was formal, precise, designed to sound unchallengeable. It referenced bylaws I had never seen, agreements I had never signed, and obligations I had never accepted. And yet, according to this document, I was already in violation of all of them. At the bottom, there was a deadline. Short, deliberately short. Failure to remit payment within the stated period will result in legal escalation, including but not limited to liens, access restrictions, and further financial penalties. I let out a slow breath. A lien. On my land. The idea was so ridiculous, I almost laughed again. But this time it didn't come out. Because something about this didn't feel like a bluff. It felt structured. Planned. I flipped to the second page. That's where it got worse. It was a map. Not the one I had. Not the one I trusted. A different one. Cleaner. Updated. Official looking in a way that made it harder to dismiss. And on that map, my land was inside a boundary. Not near it. Not adjacent. Inside it. I stared at it for a long time, trying to line it up in my head with what I knew to be true. It didn't match. It couldn't match. But it was there, drawn clearly, like it had always been that way. At the top of the page was the name I had seen on the sign the day before. The HOA, printed in bold. Confident, like it had authority. I grabbed my own documents from the shelf and spread them out across the table. Date, original survey, county filings, everything I had relied on when I bought the land. Side by side, the difference was obvious. My documents showed separation, independence, clean boundaries with nothing overlapping. There showed integration, absorption, like my land had been quietly folded into something larger without my knowledge. I ran a hand over my face, trying to slow my thoughts down. There had to be a point where this broke. Somewhere in the process, something had to be wrong. A filing error, a miscommunication, a legal gap. Because if this was real, if this was actually enforceable, then it meant something had changed without me ever being told. And that wasn't how this was supposed to work. I reached for my phone. Signal was weak, like always, but enough to make a call if I stepped outside. The number on the notice was clear. Direct. I didn't hesitate. It rang twice before someone answered. Association office, a voice said. Calm, professional, unfamiliar. Yeah, I said, trying to keep my tone steady. I just found a notice on my property. There's been some kind of mistake. A pause. Property address, the voice asked. I gave it. There was a brief silence, the faint sound of typing in the background. Then, there is no mistake. The answer came too quickly, too confidently. That's not possible, I said. I've owned this land for 8 years. There's no HOA connected to it. Your property falls within the jurisdiction of the association. The voice replied, same tone, same pace. All applicable dues have been assessed accordingly. I tightened my grip on the phone. Based on what? I asked. I never agreed to anything. I never signed anything. Agreements are attached to the land, not the individual, the voice said. Ownership transfer does not void existing obligations. That land didn't have any obligations, I snapped. I checked everything before I bought it. Another pause. Then, your documentation may be outdated. That hit harder than I expected. Outdated. Like the last 8 years of my life have been built on something that could just shift under me. That's not how this works, I said, my voice lower now. You don't just add land into an HOA without notifying the owner. Notification procedures were followed in accordance with county regulations, the voice replied. I never received anything. That does not invalidate the obligation. Silence. Not from them. From me. Because for the first time since this started, I didn't have an immediate response. They weren't arguing. They weren't threatening. They were stating. Like everything they were saying had already been decided long before I picked up the phone. Look, I said finally, forcing the words out slowly. There's been some kind of overlap or error. I need documentation. Proof. Something that shows how my land is connected to your association. You may submit a formal request, the voice said. Processing time is outlined in the notice. I let out a short breath. And in the meantime, the balance remains due. Of course it did. $47,000, I said, for services I've never used, in a community I'm not part of. Non-payment will result in escalation. There was again, not a threat, a procedure. I closed my eyes for a second, then opened them again, staring out at the land in front of me. My land. At least it had been. I'm not paying that, I said. Another pause. Longer this time. Then, that is your decision. The line went quiet. Not disconnected. Just finished. I lowered the phone slowly, the weight of the situation settling in fully now. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a simple mistake that would be cleared up with a call or a form. This was something else. Something deeper. More calculated. I walked back inside the cabin and looked at the notice again, laying flat on the table like it belonged there. Because in their world it did. Pay now or face legal action. I read the line again, slower this time. Then I looked around the cabin, at the walls I had built, the systems I had created, the life I had spent 8 years putting together, piece by piece. And for the first time since I stepped onto this land, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not doubt, not fear, something sharper, anger. Because whatever this was, however they thought this was going to go, they had made one very clear mistake. They thought I didn't understand what I owned, and they thought I wouldn't fight back. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was scared, but because my mind wouldn't stop moving. Every angle, every possibility, every small detail I might have missed over the last 8 years kept replaying in my head like a loop I couldn't shut off. By sunrise, I'd already made a decision. If they wanted to fight, they were going to get one. But I wasn't going to rush it, because something about the way they handled that call told me everything I needed to know. They weren't guessing. They weren't hoping I'd just pay. They expected resistance, and they were prepared for it. That meant one thing. I needed to be smarter than them, not louder. The first step was simple. Information. I gathered every document I had and laid them out again, this time not just to confirm what I already knew, but to look for anything that could be used against me. Original deed. Clean. Survey report. Precise. County filing. Approved and recorded years before any development started near this area. There were no obvious weaknesses, but that didn't mean there weren't hidden ones. By mid-morning, I drove into town. Not for supplies this time. For answers. The county records office wasn't much to look at, Small building, quiet, almost forgotten. The kind of place people only go when they absolutely have to. Inside, it was even quieter. A woman behind the counter looked up as I walked in, giving me a neutral nod. "Can I help you?" "I need access to property records," I said. "Recent filings, boundary changes, anything related to new developments outside town." She studied me for a second, like she was trying to place me. Then she nodded toward a row of computers. "Public access is over there." I thanked her and sat down. What I found over the next hour didn't make things better. It made them worse. There had been filings, multiple ones, over the past few years. New development plans, zoning adjustments, infrastructure expansions, all centered around the same area I had seen being cleared. At first glance, everything looked legitimate. Approved, signed, processed through the proper channels. But the deeper I went, the more something started to stand out. The language. It was careful, too careful. Phrases like adjacent land inclusion and future integration potential appeared in places they didn't need to. Vague enough to avoid attention, but specific enough to mean something. I printed everything I could find, because even if I didn't fully understand it yet, I knew it mattered. On my way out, I stopped at the counter. "Quick question," I said. "If land gets added to a development, how is the owner notified?" The woman didn't hesitate. "Official notice. Mail, usually. Sometimes multiple attempts. What if they never receive it?" She shrugged slightly. "If it was sent correctly, it's considered delivered." That didn't sit right. "So even if I never saw it, it still counts?" She gave me a look this time. Not defensive, just direct. "That's how the system works." I nodded slowly, thanking her, but the answer stayed with me long after I left. Because if that was true, then they didn't need me to agree. They just needed to prove they had tried. When I got back to the cabin, there was another envelope waiting. This one wasn't nailed to the door. It was placed. Carefully, deliberately. I picked it up without opening it right away, because I already knew what it was. Pressure. I stepped inside, sat down, and opened it. Another notice. Same amount. Same language. But this time there was something new. A timeline. Shorter than before. And a line added near the bottom. "Failure to respond will result in immediate escalation, including property lien processing." I stared at that line for a long moment, because now it wasn't just a threat. It was a countdown. That's when I realized something important. They weren't waiting for me to figure this out. They were moving forward either way, which meant I couldn't afford to stay reactive. I had to get ahead of them. That night, I made another decision. If the system worked the way that woman described, then I needed someone who knew how to break it apart. A lawyer. The next morning, I drove further than usual, past the small town I normally relied on, to a larger one with actual offices. Real legal firms. People who dealt with things like this regularly, not just local disputes or paperwork. It took a few tries before I found someone willing to even listen. Most of them brushed it off quickly. "HOA dispute? You'll need to negotiate with them. I don't handle association law. 47,000? You should consider settlement options." None of them understood. Or maybe they just didn't want to get involved. But then I found one who didn't interrupt, didn't dismiss it, just listened. I laid everything out. The land, the timeline, the markers, the sign, the notice, the call. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, silent for a moment. Then he said something that stuck. "This doesn't sound accidental." I nodded. "It's not." He tapped a finger lightly on the stack of papers I had brought. "They're either operating within a very specific legal window, or they're hoping you won't realize where they stepped outside it." That was the first time someone had said it clearly. "They're counting on pressure," he continued. "Short deadlines, escalating threats, complex language. It's designed to make you feel like you're already behind." I thought about the notices, the calls, the tone. It all fit. "So what do I do?" I asked. He looked at me directly. "We slow them down." That wasn't what I expected. Slow them down? "They're moving fast for a reason," he said. "Probably because they know something you don't, or they're trying to act before you find it." That made sense. Uncomfortably so. "So we respond," he continued. "Formally. Request documentation. Challenge their claim. Force them to show their hand. And the money? Don't pay it," he said immediately. "Not until we know exactly what this is." For the first time since this started, I felt something shift. Not relief, but direction, a plan. I left his office with more questions than answers, but at least now I wasn't standing still. Back at the cabin, the land looked the same as it always had. Quiet, still, unchanged. But now I knew better, because something had already started moving beneath the surface. And I was finally moving with it. I placed the latest notice on the table next to the first one, both of them sitting there like they belonged, like they had authority, like they meant something. I looked at them for a moment, then turned away, because one thing was clear now. They thought pressure would break me. They thought time was on their side. They thought I'd panic, fold, or settle just to make it go away. But they didn't know me. They didn't know what it took to survive out here for 8 years. And they definitely didn't know what I was willing to do to protect what was mine. They had started this. Now, I was ready to finish it. Slowing them down was one thing. Beating them was something else entirely. The moment I committed to fighting this, I knew it wouldn't be quick. It wouldn't be clean either. Whatever they had built, this claim, this pressure, this sudden authority, wasn't random. It was structured, and structure leaves a trail. You just have to know where to look. The first few days after meeting the lawyer were different. Focused, controlled. Instead of reacting to their notices, I started working through a plan. Every document I had was organized, copied, and backed up. Every interaction was written down, dates, times, exact wording. If they wanted to play this like a system, then I was going to treat it like one too. But the real work started back at the county office. This time, I wasn't just browsing. I knew what I was looking for. Filing history. Not just the obvious development records, but everything connected to the land over time. Ownership transfers, boundary adjustments, easements, old surveys that might have been overlooked or buried under newer filings. Anything that could explain how my land had suddenly moved without actually moving. Hours passed without much progress. Most of what I found confirmed what I already knew. Clean ownership, no shared agreements, no community ties, until I stopped looking at the present and went further back. Years back, before I bought the land, before any development started creeping toward it. That's where things started to change. There was an older record, buried under layers of newer filings. Easy to miss if you weren't digging specifically for it. It wasn't large, not detailed, just a reference. A proposed development plan that had never fully materialized. It mentioned multiple parcels of land, including areas surrounding mine, but not clearly including mine itself. At least, not directly. What caught my attention wasn't what it said. It was how it said it. Future expansion rights reserved pending acquisition or integration agreements. I read that line 3 times, because it didn't mean anything on its own, but it opened a door someone else might have tried to walk through later. I printed the record and kept digging. More files, more references, small connections that didn't stand out individually, but together they started forming something. A pattern. The same development group kept appearing. Different names on the surface, but tied together underneath. Subsidiaries, partner companies, shell entities designed to make everything look separate while still connected. And then I found it. A filing from just a few years ago. Not for my land, but for land directly adjacent to it. The language was almost identical to what I had seen before. Only this time, it wasn't a proposal. It was approved. That's when it clicked. They hadn't taken my land. They had built everything around it, positioned themselves, expanded outward, and then adjusted the lines. Not physically, on paper. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the screen. Because if that was true, then this wasn't about ownership. It was about interpretation. They weren't claiming I had agreed to join them. They were claiming I had always been part of it, or at least that they could make it look that way. I took everything I found and brought it back to the lawyer. He didn't say much while reviewing it. Just read. Quiet. Focused. But I could see it in the way his expression shifted slightly. He saw it too. This is where they're working from, he said finally, tapping the older record. They're using that. I asked. Not directly, he said, but give them a foundation. Something vague enough to build an argument on. It doesn't include my land. No, he agreed. But it suggests the possibility of inclusion. That's not the same thing. It isn't, he said. But if they've layered enough new filings on top of it, They might be trying to make it look like a continuation instead of change. I let that sink in. They're rewriting the story, I said. Exactly. That word stuck. Story. Because that's what this felt like now. Two versions of the same reality. Mine, based on what was actually there. Theirs, based on what they could convince others to accept. So, where do they break? I asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he flipped through the documents again, slower this time, looking for something specific. And then he stopped, right on one page. This, he said. I leaned forward. It was a boundary reference. Small, technical, easy to overlook, but it was wrong. Not obviously wrong, but inconsistent with everything else. They adjusted this line, he said, but they didn't update the supporting records that define it. I frowned. Meaning they changed the map, but not the foundation behind it. I felt something shift again. That same feeling from before. Direction. If that holds, he continued, then their entire claim depends on a boundary that doesn't legally exist the way they're presenting it. And the dues wouldn't apply. I exhaled slowly. For the first time since this started, I wasn't just reacting. I had something real. Something they couldn't just pressure away. Is it enough? I asked. He nodded once. It's a start. A start was all I needed. Because now, this wasn't about guessing anymore. It was about proving. Over the next few days, we built everything around that point. Every document cross-referenced. Every inconsistency highlighted. Every assumption they were relying on challenged. And the more we dug, the clearer it became. They hadn't just overstepped. They had counted on no one noticing. That no one would take the time to connect the dots. That the pressure would work before the truth had a chance to catch up. But now it was catching up. Fast. Back at the cabin, I stood outside longer than usual that night, looking out over the land. The same land they were trying to claim. The same land I had built my life on. Nothing had changed physically. No fences moved. No trees cut. No ground taken. And yet, on paper, they had tried to turn it into something else entirely. That was their mistake. Because paper can be challenged. Paper could be exposed. And now, I had exactly what I needed to do it. I went back inside, laid out the documents one more time, and looked at the notices sitting beside them. The $47,000 demand. The deadlines. The threats. All of it built on something that didn't hold the way they needed it to. I picked up the latest notice, glanced at it once, then set it back down. Because now, it didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt weak. And for the first time since this started, I knew something they didn't. They weren't in control anymore. I was. The meeting was scheduled faster than I expected. Not weeks later. Not months. Days. That alone told me something had changed. They weren't stalling anymore. They weren't sending more notices. They weren't increasing the pressure the way they had before. Instead, they agreed to a formal meeting, documents, representatives, legal presence, which meant one thing. They knew I had found something. The morning of the meeting didn't feel dramatic. No tension music. No heavy thoughts. Just quiet focus. I gathered everything carefully, every document we had reviewed, every inconsistency highlighted, every timeline note organized in the exact order it needed to be. If this turned into a fight of details, I wasn't going to lose because of something small. The drive into town felt longer than usual. Not because of distance, because of what it meant. 8 years ago, I had left everything behind to build something on my own land. Now I was driving back toward the same system I thought I had escaped. Only this time, I wasn't walking in unprepared. The office building looked exactly like you'd expect an HOA office to look. Clean, controlled, quiet in a way that felt artificial. Inside, the room was already set up when I walked in. 3 people on one side of the table. Me and my lawyer on the other. No introductions. No small talk. Just paperwork. One of them, a man in his late 50s, sharp suit, calm expression, slid a folder slightly forward. You requested documentation, he said. Everything relevant is included. I didn't touch it. Not yet. Instead, I placed our own folder on the table first. Slowly, deliberately, the lawyer beside me opened it and turned it toward them. You want to look at this before continuing, he said calmly. The man didn't react immediately, just glanced down, then reached forward and opened the file. Silence filled the room. Not tense, not aggressive, just quiet enough that every small movement felt louder than it should have. Page by page, his expression didn't change, but the pace of his reading did. Slower, more careful, less confident. One of the others leaned slightly closer, trying to see what he was looking at. "What is this?" she asked quietly. "Original boundary references," my lawyer replied. "Filed before the development plan you're relying on." The man didn't speak. He just turned another page, and another. Finally, he looked up. "This doesn't invalidate the association's jurisdiction," he said. Calm voice, controlled tone, but something underneath it had shifted slightly. "It does if the boundary you're using doesn't legally exist," my lawyer replied. That landed, not loudly, but clearly. The woman across the table straightened slightly. The boundary was adjusted through proper filing procedures. Partially, my lawyer said. The map was adjusted. The supporting legal definition behind it was not. Another pause, this time longer, because now they weren't responding automatically anymore. They were thinking, which meant the advantage had shifted. I leaned forward slightly, placing one specific document on the table between us. "That line," I said, pointing at it. "That's where everything changes, right?" No one answered immediately, because they knew I wasn't guessing anymore. I understood what they had done. And more importantly, I understood where it broke. "That adjustment assumes my land was already connected to the development," I continued. "But it wasn't. Not when I bought it. Not when the first filings were made. Not even when the expansion started." The man finally spoke again. "You are interpreting the records incorrectly." I shook my head slowly. "No," I said. "I'm reading them in order." That was the moment everything shifted. Not dramatically, not emotionally, structurally. Because their argument only worked if no one questioned the timeline. If no one went back far enough to see what came first and what came later. And I had. My lawyer turned another page in the file and slid toward them. "Original survey date," he said calmly. "Recorded years before your development existed in any official form. That makes this property independent by definition." The room went quiet again. The kind of quiet where people aren't waiting to speak. They're deciding whether they should. The woman glanced at the man in the suit. He didn't look at her. He just stared at the document for a few seconds longer than he needed to, because he knew what it meant. This wasn't just a disagreement anymore. This was exposure. You attempted to apply 8 years of dues to a property that was never legally part of the association, my lawyer continued. That opens the door to more than just a correction. The word hung in the air. More. Because now it wasn't just about me. It was about what they had tried to do, and how far they had gone before anyone pushed back. Finally, the man closed the folder. Slowly, carefully. Then he looked at me directly for the first time since I walked in. "Your position is noted," he said. That was it. Not denial. Not argument. Just acknowledgement. Which told me everything I needed to know. Because if they were confident, they would have pushed harder. Dismissed it. Shut it down. Instead, they stopped. And stopping meant one thing. They weren't sure they could win anymore. We didn't argue after that. No raised voices. No dramatic accusations. Just a controlled conversation where every sentence felt like it mattered more than it should. By the end of the meeting, one thing was clear. They weren't pushing the $47,000 anymore. Not directly. Instead, they said they needed time to review the documentation further, which was just a professional way of saying, "We didn't expect this." When I walked out of the building, the air felt different. Not lighter, just clearer. For weeks, everything had felt like it was closing in: deadlines, notices, pressure, threats. But now, for the first time, it felt like the direction had flipped. They weren't chasing me anymore. I had forced them to stop. I stood outside for a moment, looking back at the building behind me. 8 years of silence had ended with one piece of paper nailed to my door. And they thought that paper would scare me into paying something I didn't owe. What they didn't expect was someone who actually understood what it meant to own land. Someone who didn't panic. Someone who didn't fold. Someone who was willing to sit across from them and force the truth into the open. Because now, it wasn't just about the money. It was about something bigger. They had tried to rewrite the boundaries. Tried to claim authority where none existed. Tried to turn pressure into control. And they almost got away with it. Almost. But as I got back into the truck and started the drive home, one thought stayed with me the entire time. The meeting hadn't ended the fight. It had just exposed it. And once something like that gets exposed, it doesn't stay hidden for long. The weeks that followed were tense, but controlled. I didn't get another immediate notice. No new threats. No sudden calls demanding payment. Just silence. That kind of silence felt heavier than anything before. It wasn't the absence of noise. It was the absence of certainty. They were moving carefully now, and so was I. My lawyer and I stayed ahead of every communication. Every document they sent, every vague claim they hinted at, was met with careful, precise, and formal responses. No anger, no emotion, just facts. The weight of truth on our side. It wasn't long before they responded formally. Official letters acknowledging errors in their assessment. Every claim that had been used to justify the $47,000 dues was systematically withdrawn. Each accusation carefully dismantled by the evidence we had gathered. Their authority, which had seemed untouchable for weeks, crumbled quietly on paper. I remember the first letter clearly. It was short, professional, and entirely in our favor. Upon review, the association acknowledges the property in question is not subject to dues, fees, or obligations of the association. Any prior assessments are hereby null and void. That one line, so simple, felt heavier than all the notices they had sent combined. Relief? Of course, but also something stronger. Satisfaction, vindication, not just because they had been wrong, but because they had tried to manipulate and pressure someone who had done nothing wrong. For the first time in nearly a decade, I felt the weight of 8 years of isolation and vigilance shift from tension to clarity. Every hardship, every early morning, every repair, every careful step I'd taken to protect my land had been worth it. I hadn't just survived off-grid. I had defended the integrity of my life and property. The HOA attempted no further action. The stakes they had tried to plant on my land were removed from any official record, leaving my boundaries untouched and fully recognized. It was more than a legal victory. It was a confirmation that years of patience, careful observation, and unwavering commitment had the power to protect what mattered most. After the dust settled, I returned to my routine. Not exactly the same as before, because nothing ever feels the same after confrontation like that, but familiar. Walking the edges of my land, checking my systems, tending to my crops. Sitting outside the cabin at night, watching the trees sway in the breeze, listening to the silence that now felt truly mine. I thought about the HOA frequently in those first weeks of quiet, about how something that had been so threatening could be undone simply by understanding the rules, by paying attention, and by refusing to be intimidated. There was a lesson there, not just about land, but about life. Pressure only works if you let it, and truth only needs time to be recognized. 8 years off-grid had taught me endurance. Living isolated had taught me resourcefulness. And fighting the HOA had taught me courage in a different sense. The courage to stand firm even when the odds seemed stacked, even when the letters, notices, and deadlines threatened to crush you. I kept the notices, all of them, laid them in order on my table, and looked at them from time to time, not as reminders of stress, but as proof that I had faced something designed to intimidate me, and had not only survived but emerged intact, stronger than before. Sometimes I think about the people in the office, the calm tones of their letters and calls, and I realize something. They were just doing their job, or at least what they thought was their job. But I wasn't part of their script. I wasn't going to follow their story. I had my own, and my story was grounded in reality, truth, and persistence. The land, after all, doesn't lie. The surveys, the boundaries, the measurements, they tell the real story if you know how to read them. And I did. That knowledge, combined with experience and patience, was my greatest asset. Not my cabin, not my solar panels, not even my isolation. It was understanding and defending the truth. Months later, when I walked across the ridge near the edge of my property, I noticed the markers had vanished. The stakes, the signs, the subtle hints that something had been approaching, it was all gone. The land felt quiet again. Safe. Mine in every sense that mattered. And yet, I didn't take it for granted. I knew better now. Ownership isn't just about holding a deed. It's about vigilance, responsibility, and knowing when to act. Sitting outside one evening, watching the sun sink behind the distant tree line, I thought about the entire journey. 8 years off-grid, building a life from nothing. Early mornings and long nights. Isolation that had felt lonely at times, but had been crucial in teaching focus and patience. Then the sudden intrusion, the sudden attempt to claim authority over what was mine. The fight had been exhausting, intense, challenging in ways I hadn't anticipated. But when it ended, it wasn't just about winning. It was about proving something to them and to myself, that even against sophisticated pressure and unexpected challenges, integrity and careful preparation could prevail. I leaned back, letting the quiet fill me. The cabin was still. The trees rustled gently. The land stretched out, unbroken, unclaimed, fully my own. And for the first time in years, I felt completely at peace. Because I hadn't just lived off-grid for 8 years. I had survived it, thrived in it. And when the world tried to impose rules that weren't mine, I defended every inch of it. That land, those 8 years, and every challenge along the way, had shaped me into someone who didn't just own property. I owned my life, my choices, and my truth. And that, I realized as the sun disappeared below the horizon, was worth more than any amount of money, any notice, or any threat could ever take away.